Okay, in our last tutorial, we were looking at the problems of deforestation and plastics in the ocean. And we actually started originally looking at the issue of climate change. So far, we've dealt with the big problem of the planet warming up and where in the world it's warming up. The second thing we've looked at is the causes of that warming, and we've been introduced to this idea of carbon dioxide being one of the big problems. Our second big problem has been deforestation, and we've explored where in the world are we cutting the most trees down and where actually in the world are we planting trees. Our third one, which we did at the end of the last lesson, was the issue of plastics in the ocean. And we've looked at where in the world is producing the most plastics that are going into our oceans. And I also introduced this idea that interactive maps online allow us to look at data in a much more easy and convenient way than maybe looking at it on a piece of paper or in an atlas. Now, we're just going to continue with this idea of plastic waste in our oceans because you will see that there is a graph here about surface plastic mass by ocean basin. So this is in which oceans, back in 2013, would you find the most plastic floating in the oceans? And we can see the global total is 268,950 tons of plastic are floating in our oceans. But actually, and that's just floating on the surface, by the way, not what's down below. We can break that up into the different oceans. So the Pacific is actually split between the North Pacific and the South Pacific, and the Atlantic is actually split between the North and the South Atlantic. The question says, describe what this graph tells you about plastic in the oceans. Now, a really simple answer would just be to see it tells us that the amount of plastic floating in the oceans and where it's at its worst. That would be a pretty simple answer. A better answer would say it shows us which oceans have got the most plastic in them and which areas of ocean have the least amount of plastics. That would be a reasonable answer. A very good answer would say it shows us where the most plastic floating in the oceans is, which oceans, and it tells us which is the most, and we can see that this is the North Pacific with 96,400. We can see the second most common is, and the third is also, okay? And we could then say that the ocean with the least amount of plastic floating in it is, and we can identify in the map, not just which, but how much, okay? When you do graphs like this, you then can start to not just see which is the most and which is the least, but you get to compare them quite easily. So I can see, if I do some quick sums, that the North Pacific, which is the ocean with the most plastic floating on the surface, is roughly 8 times higher than the South Atlantic, which is the one with the least, okay? And I get to do that comparison. What that then might make me think is, why is the North Pacific so high compared to the South Atlantic? So when I then go and look at this map, there's the North Atlantic, there's America, there's Europe. These are rich countries that produce lots of plastic waste. And between them sits the North Atlantic, which is the ocean which is pretty bad. If I then look at the North Pacific, that's this ocean here, look what lies. There's one country that lies on this side of the North Pacific. But if I go to the other side of the Pacific, I get to this coast. This is the United States. So I can probably start to understand why the North Pacific is so bad. I could explain that. I then might look at this graph and say, so why is the South Atlantic so low? Well, there's the South Atlantic. Look at the continent that lies over here. Is it producing a lot of plastic waste? And you probably say, no, it's not. So the amount of plastic floating in our oceans is partly to do with the countries that surround those oceans and how much plastic they are producing. Okay. Now, there's no question that asks you about that. It's just a simple describe what the graph shows. Right, let's move on to our final issue. Now, this is a very worrying issue. We're going to spend a bit of time looking at this one this year. It's gaining a lot of global importance as people recognize the problem is getting worse. This is to do with soil degradation. It's where the soil is degrading. So what this means is that the soil quality is getting worse and therefore is less able to grow things. Okay? A very degraded soil is unable to grow many plants, and if it gets worse, the soil will completely die, turning the land into desert. A desert is an area without any soil and therefore has no living vegetation, because all living vegetation obviously needs soil. So we can see a map of the world that shows us where the land is most degraded. First of all, we can see where it has no vegetation at all, and these link either with the deserts, like the Sahara here, or Greenland, which is covered in ice. Areas that are very degraded are in orange, and areas that are very degraded are in dark orange, or almost red. And the question says, what does this map show? Well, I think that's kind of obvious, but I'd like you to write in a sentence. And finally, without any assistance, because I've done this now 3 times, how would you describe? Now, one difference you've got this time is you don't have countries. Your map's not divided into countries. So when you do this, you want to do it by continent. So we've got South America, North America, Africa, Europe, Asia, all of this area here, and Australia or Australasia. And when you take a continent, divide it into the parts. So if you're going to talk about the top of Africa, don't say the top of Africa, say Northern Africa. If you're going to say the coastal areas of South America, or you could say the east, that's this bit, and the west coast. If you're going to talk about North America, you'd probably want to divide it between the top, the northern part, which in this case is Canada, and the central area, which in this case is the United States and Mexico. So give me some specific descriptive areas that have the worst or the most degraded soil, and the areas with stable soil. And give me specific descriptions of the areas within the continents where it is either worst or not as worse. Okay? And that concludes our first series of lessons, which is looking at where are these problems happening. What we're going to go into next lesson is looking to explain why they're happening. So what are the causes of these problems?